we know this could be our last life ever. Ask yourself, are you living your best life? Have you fulfilled your innermost dreams? Our guest today, Jeff Holst, graduated from law school with honors and became a successful attorney that had completed his personal bucket list by the time he was 30 years old. Unfortunately, life threw him a curveball by temporarily setting him back with leukemia. After winning the fight against leukemia, Jeff decided to focus on designing life the way he wanted. He began aggressively investing in real estate, and in a few short years, he's a happy and healthy multimillionaire, still traveling and sharing his experience with others so that they too can live their last life ever to the fullest. Jeff walks us through his real estate investing journey, including the early mindset challenge he faced, why he ventured into some retail properties, and why he wishes he had gone big earlier and invest in multifamily buildings. Today I'd like to welcome Jeff Holst, the host of Old Fashioned Real Estate Podcast, to the show. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
All right. So why don't we go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you got started in real estate?
Sure. So I was probably one of those weird kids that always liked real estate. So I used to stay up late and watch Carlton Sheets, No Money Down infomercials when I was like 15. Like I literally would sneak out of my bedroom late at night and go watch infomercials about investing in real estate. So I guess it's kind of stuck in my blood somewhere, and I don't really even know where that is. I remember when I was like 10 or 11 driving by like these old factory buildings in Grand Rapids, where I was growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and thinking someday I'd like to own one of those. And I said something like that to my mom, and I think she thought I was a little insane back then. So, but I actually didn't start buying real estate until about 2010, even though I wanted to from like the mid 90s on. So that's when I got started. I went to law school back in the late 90s, early 2000s, graduated in 2007. And then I started practicing law. I did mostly bankruptcy work, a little bit of divorce and criminal work. And then I ended up getting sick, actually. I had leukemia in 2008. Thought I was going to die for a few days there. It's a real game changer. So that's when I thought I need to do something different with my life. And I got into real estate at that time. So.
All right. So when you transitioned into real estate, did you jump right into multifamily, or what was the process behind that?
No. So, I mean, I didn't have any money. Actually, after I got sick, I ended up filing personal bankruptcy. So I didn't have any credit or any money. So that made it a little challenging to get into real estate. But what we did is I took a job and I made reasonably good money at that time. And I went and I just started taking the money that I had from the job, and I partnered with a friend of mine from law school to buy a condo, actually in Metro Detroit. That was the first deal that we did. It was a condo that was like maybe 110,000 a few years earlier, but this is 2010, so it was bank owned, and we bought it for $30,000 cash. So we each put in about $15,000 of our savings. And then we just took it off from there. Like we rented it out. Actually, we still own it today. So it's probably back up, in the $150,000 range, something like that. And it rents consistently the whole time. We actually ended up buying one more in that same building about a month or two later. And I didn't have any money left because I just spent all of my savings on the first one. And my partner was generous enough to loan me money to cover half of that one, which I've since repaid. And then that's really where we started.
So how did you, and at what point did you make the decision to transition into multifamily properties?
So it was a long time later, actually. So I kept buying real estate from 2010 on, and we started doing a little bit of private money funding. We had one investor in particular that we made a deal with him where we would basically, he would loan money to a company that the three of us owned, and we would pay him interest from that company, and then we'd go buy something. And so we'd each own a third of it. So we bought quite a few things that way. We ended up borrowing about $1 million from him over the next 5 years. And then we bought, I think it was around 40 or 45 single family residences, houses and condos, a few duplexes. And that took me till about 2017. So in 2017, I was still working at this trucking company, and they were getting ready to sell out to a bigger company. They offered me a job at this giant corporation, and I thought, I can't imagine ever doing that.
Mhm.
And so I opted to take a small severance and walk away. And it was at that point, actually, I figured I could live off of the real estate I had, but it would be kind of tight. And I was like, I need to do something with my time anyway. So that's when I really started looking into multifamily. About 3 months after I left my job is when I bought my first multifamily unit. It was a 12 unit in North Georgia, near Chattanooga, where I live now.
Wow. So you went right into a 12 unit. So can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. So I took my severance money and a little bit of savings that I had, and I partnered with my dad, who had a little bit of money saved up, and we just went and bought. I found it on LoopNet. I think I actually overpaid for it. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't overpay too much, so it's worked out pretty well. But we refinanced it last month, pulled out more than our original down payment, and we still have it. And it still cash flows a couple $1,000s a month now. But we've had to put some money into it and fix up some units and raise the rents and control the expenses. So it's just been a really big learning experience. I think we overpaid maybe 10 to 15% on it. But the market's kind of bailed us out because we've got the rent increases. And then of course, the last 3 years, cap rates have compressed pretty dramatically everywhere. So that's helped us a lot also.
Now, at the right before we got on the call, or before we started recording, you mentioned that a lot of the multifamily deals that you've done were mostly joint ventures, right?
That's right. Yeah. In
So,
fact, almost all of them were joint ventures. So the next deal that we did, I bought the 12 unit with my dad, and then I think my partner from Michigan got a little. We had been talking about doing multifamily for a while. He was like, "Wow, if you can do it, then we should be doing it here too." So we went and bought a 19 unit, which we closed about a month after the 12 unit. We put them under contract about a month apart and closed them about a month apart. That 19 unit, we utilized the same strategy we had for most of our single families, which was we had the one investor that partners with us loan some money to this new company that we formed to buy it. And then we went and bought it. So I didn't have any of my own money in that particular deal, but I did have, a personal guarantee for the down payment. Actually, it was a little more complicated than that, but it worked out. And so we bought that 19 unit. Again, I think we paid a little bit too much for that one, but that one's a great property and cash flows like crazy right now. So I'm pretty happy we have it. I think we're going to refinance that one pretty quick too. Tons of value add on that one. We raised the rents over $200 a door. So it's been really,
wow,
really good.
wow.
Yeah. And then about 3 or 4 months after that, we did a 1031 exchange where we sold 10 single family houses. And we 1031 into a 32 unit apartment building, also Metro Detroit, north side of Detroit, outside of the city limits. And that one's also been really great. The mistake I think we made there was that was our first non-recourse deal. And we locked in a really long and onerous prepayment penalty. And now rates have come down since then. And we have the yield maintenance for another 7 years.
Wow.
And so that's kind of annoying. And then of course we had a huge value add on that one too. So we have tons of locked up equity that we really can't tap without paying a pretty big prepayment penalty. So, it cash flows really well because we have this super great financing on it. It's just locked up for a really long time. So we're just going to have to ride that one out. But, it's kind of like we started buying these things and we just figured we'd figure it out as we went, just like we did when we started buying single families. And it's worked out really well. I think the biggest mistake we made was not starting sooner. The multifamily stuff is just a tremendous opportunity.
So I'm very curious because, listening to you speak, you've mentioned Michigan and Detroit specifically, right? So a
Sure.
lot of these multifamily properties were purchased in Detroit, I take it, right?
That's right. So
Okay.
about 80% of my assets are in Metro Detroit. Not
Okay.
very much in the city. We used to buy in the city limits, but
Hmm.
when we started selling our single families, we focused on some of the suburbs outside of Wayne County, Macomb County, which is just north of Detroit area, is really where we focus right now. But we're expanding our reach because there's only so many buildings that qualify for what we're looking for in there. So now we're starting to branch out again into a little bit wider geographical area, and
Hmm.
that's with my partner in Michigan. And then in Chattanooga, my partner on the Old Fashioned Real Estate Show and I have been buying down here. And then recently, the three of us, my Michigan partner and my Chattanooga partner, started buying stuff together down here as well.
So, if I may ask, what was it that attracted you to the Detroit market in particular?
Yeah, well, we were buying it when the people on all the other podcasts were saying, "Duh, Detroit is a war zone. It's the worst place in the world." But we were buying houses for a while for like a few $1,000s that would rent out for $500 or $600 a month, and so the returns were ridiculous. People would talk about like the 1 or 2% rule and that stuff, and we were getting like, if we didn't have like a 12%, of the rents or something, then we weren't even interested in it. So the returns were amazing back then, and we were actually we would get a stabilized tenant in some of these properties, and then we would sell it to an out of state or out of country investor, use that money to go buy a little bit nicer property for us to hold. So we ended up being able to accumulate a pretty nice portfolio cheaply as a result of that. But the real thing that attracted me to the market, honestly, was I had this friend that I met in law school that had a property management company there, and he was doing well, and he wanted to partner with me. And I'm a big fan of making it a team sport. If you try to do it on your own, it's much, much harder. If you have someone that's already doing what you want to do that wants to work with you, you can synergize some of your things. Like I had some connections and some ideas on how to structure deals so that we could expand faster. And he had the network on the ground with the contractors and really just the ability to find the right properties in the right neighborhoods. Because if you go just throw a dart at Detroit and buy something, even today, you're very likely to hit a neighborhood that's not a neighborhood you want to invest in. So you have to have a lot of knowledge about that market. And I think one thing that I always tell people when they ask me about real estate is that it's really a function of all investing, really, not just real estate, is a function of the amount of effort that you're willing to put in and the amount of knowledge you have about whatever it is you're doing, and then the amount of risk you're willing to take. But you can mitigate that risk by having more knowledge. So that's what we do, is we just go out and we look for areas where we have a competitive advantage. And in Detroit is one of them, because I have this partner there that's extremely good at investing in Detroit. So the reason I invest in Chattanooga, frankly, is I have a competitive advantage here, and I have a partner that has a property management company here. And also I'm here, so I understand this market really well. There are a couple of other markets I'm very comfortable in, because like Grand Rapids, Michigan, the other side of Michigan where I grew up, I'm very comfortable there, but I haven't found exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm just, I'm biding my time on that.
So in Chattanooga, is that kind of like the market that you're looking at right now for the syndications? Because I know you mentioned to me, you said you're transitioning into syndications now.
Yeah, so we've actually done a couple of syndications in Chattanooga. I think we've done 3 now. Smaller deals. One's a office building, one's a strip mall. So those are not really multifamily. And then we just did a 22-unit multifamily building that we're going to convert into condominiums. So it's a little
Okay.
bit of a different project. So the key on all of those is we're looking for value add opportunities, and we're kind of targeting. There's a ton of people trying to buy the, $5 million and up, loan balance stuff, but there's not that many people buying $2 and $3 million buildings, actually. The mom and pop operators are kind of afraid once they get over about $1 million, and the big operators aren't really interested if it's under about 5 or 6 million. And so there's a real opportunity to get some great returns there. So that's why we've been kind of targeting that. But we have been actively seeking bigger deals. It's just that the market is so competitive, and we're just not interested in just raising money to raise money and get a deal. It has to be the right deal for our
Has to be
investors.
the right deal. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're being really cautious about that now. I've actually invested in a couple of other people's deals, in some other markets just to kind of get the feel for how they're doing it and stuff like that too. I look at this as a research period for us.
Mm-hmm.
We started buying multifamilies and then ramping up, 12, 19, 32. Then the next one was 41. We just kept ramping that up because we want to be able to say to our investors, we know what we're doing, right? We need to have that competitive advantage if we're going to be raising investor money. And it's one thing, I think, to lose your own money. It's entirely different to lose someone else's, right?
Yeah.
Like I can risk my money a lot more easily than I can risk your money.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that about the the numbers and everything on there, because I was on a call just yesterday with another syndicator, and we were talking about how with some of the deals that he lost out on recently, these are kind of like 200-300 units. And the reason he lost out was because of these large hedge funds that were coming in, and they're dropping cash, cash, quick close. And usually they're coming in like $1 million or slightly more above what it is that their underwriting is telling them that they should be coming in at, it's just really difficult to compete with them. That being said, I was on another call with some other investors, and like you said, kind of like in like the mom and pop type operator type range, and these kind of like 50 unit type size properties, the numbers, they still seem to work in that market. Right. Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, that's what we're seeing, right? So I've looked at a number of more expensive properties, and there've been a couple value add deals that looked attractive, but they were kind of outside of where we thought we could handle them right at that point. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, if you're looking at stabilized assets, yeah, I mean, you really have to be in a little bit of a smaller asset class because the hedge funds aren't interested, right? Yeah. In fact, they're not even really interested in a 100-unit building. They're looking at 200, 300, 400. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and those guys, they just need to make enough to cover their cost of capital. So they're in a completely different investing category than us. And frankly, I think they're likely to get burned, at least to some degree, because you see, it seems like dumb money to me, but I mean, they have a lot more money than me, so maybe they know what they're doing. I have no idea. They maybe have better modeling or something, but I can't compete with that, so I'm not even going to try. Right? I'm just not like when the hedge funds were buying single family houses in Florida. I wasn't going to buy houses in Florida because I couldn't compete anymore. Right? Mm-hmm. Like it's and they've cycled out of that into multifamily now, and I've even seen, I think, a trend where they're starting to move into some of the other real estate asset classes where they're looking more at commercial buildings and stuff like that as opposed to multifamily now. And that's just because the market's cyclical and those markets don't line up exactly, right? So you have like a lag. Like office buildings tend to peak a couple of years after multifamilies do, so they start shifting. And I think that might be a sign that we're getting close to a peak in multifamily, which is another reason why I'm not really interested in chasing deals right now. You have to be super conservative in your underwriting.
Yeah. I was going to ask you too, actually, speaking of, you mentioned a strip mall. So, I mean, I know this is not multifamily related, but sure. I'm actually very curious, to what this deal is about and what the thought process was behind that.
Well, so interestingly, it was a deal. It was off market. The guy who used to manage the 12 unit I bought, that first 12 unit I bought, it was owned by his aunt, and he was telling me about it one day, and we took a look at it, and the price was good, and it had about 30% vacancy. So it was, and she had sold all of her property besides this and just wanted to get rid of it. So it was a really nice price point. It's about 30,000 square foot, and we paid $1 million for it. So it was cheap on a per square foot basis. And we thought it was worth, even as is, close to $1.5 million. So that was the main reason that we were attracted to it. It turns out it's a lot harder to find tenants for a strip mall than it is for an apartment complex. So we bought that thing in October of 2018. And we only just last month got the last unit filled. So, so it's taken us a while, but it's cash flowed the whole time. I mean, we underwrote it conservatively enough that it was cash flowing a little bit, not an amazing return, but a decent return. And now it's a really solid return to our investors. They're starting, next quarter, they'll be getting, I think, over, 10, 11%, annualized returns on their capital. Plus there's a huge value add element. So they have a tremendous amount of extra equity as a result of that extra, that extra equity and income that we've gotten in it. So
yeah, from filling that 30%.
Yeah, I mean, it's just simply worth like a lot more because it's got 30% less vacancy. Now, I mean, I don't think that anyone's going to underwrite 100% occupancy, but we have some long-term tenants. There's a one national credit tenant that just renewed their lease for 5 more years, so that helps a lot.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's really stable now. There's a couple of tenants that they may move at some point, but they're smaller percentages of the building. The national one is the big one, so they take up about 30% of the building. So that would have been a bad one to lose.
Yeah.
So we're real happy that they renewed. And now, I mean, now we can look at, potentially selling it while the market's super hot and interest rates are really low. So I think that, we'll probably exit that in the next, 6 to 12 months. So if you know anyone that wants one, you just have them give me a call.
All right. Well, I hope everyone's listening out there. We could get the word out about that one. Because I've always been curious about kind of deals like this as well. I know this is actually this was right after I had finished my master's in finance, and I was looking at going back into private equity. And I was looking at a fund. In the fund, they specialized in like triple net lease properties and kind of like buying, and they had accumulated, I think it was like some $600 million in less than a year of like strip malls and things. And so I've always, been quite curious as to the strategy and thought process behind that as well, because especially now we see just kind of the overall general trend of how a lot of people are just kind of transitioning their buying to just kind of online, through the phone. So, really just kind of how risky are those types of assets now?
Yeah. So there's some stuff that you can't Amazonify, right? Like, one of our tenants is like an emergency medical clinic, right? It's a doctor's office that's like a walk-in doctor's office. I mean, you're not going to Amazon to see the doctor, right? If you're sick, you go there. Another one of our tenants is a karate studio.
Oh,
right.
Nice.
Like
Okay.
I mean, so you have tenants like that. So there's some retail stuff that's really stable. Now we do have a couple of tenants. There's one that's a bookstore, and it's they seem to be doing fine, but like, I mean, I could see that being a problem long term, right? Like bookstores might be more tricky to run. Now this is a specialty bookstore, so it's like a Christian religious bookstore. So I think that they have a dedicated group of clientele that goes there and stuff. But I still think that would be a trickier business to run than like a karate studio because of Amazon and because of, the online buying and stuff. And I think, the other thing to think about with retail is it's the one asset class that the value that's produced by it is not produced on site in most cases, right? So, if you have like a industrial building, they build stuff there, like, that can be moved. You can move an industrial building down the street and it doesn't really matter. But with retail, the location is super, super important because a lot of it's going to be walk-up business or, people that are impulse buying because they're driving by. So if you're trying to sell like, I don't know, hardware supplies or something, and, you really have to be like convenient to the people that want that, and if you're not, they're not going to buy it. So it's more, I think it's a much more difficult business to understand because you really have to look at things like traffic counts and drill down on like what the traffic count is. Like there's an example, there's a building I was looking at on a street that's sort of a commuting street going to downtown Chattanooga. And I thought this would make a good coffee shop, right? Like it would be an interesting place for a coffee shop. And I really wasn't seriously considering it, but I just look at real estate all the time. And I realized after digging into it a little bit that it was on the wrong side of the street. like that doesn't seem like it would matter, but like if you're on the right side of the street and you're going in towards downtown, then people can swing by and get a coffee really conveniently on their way to work. But if you're on the left side of the street when you're facing downtown, it's not convenient and no one's going to stop and get coffee. Mm-hmm. So given that it was on the wrong side of the street, it didn't make sense for a coffee shop. No, it might have made sense for like a fast food restaurant. People might want dinner on their way home or something, but it wouldn't work for coffee. And it's that kind of stuff that it's really easy to overlook if you're not really in that market. And why I wouldn't recommend people just willy-nilly buy a strip mall, even though it's worked out okay for us. I think it was a lot harder to dig through than we expected on the front side.
Yeah. And there are other things too that kind of just came to mind just based off of like some of the conversations I had at that time. Like, and I think you had touched on it as well, things like the credit analysis as well, because you have to consider the underlying credit of the tenant. That's
yeah. And I mean, if you look at it from a finance perspective and with a finance degree, I think you'd appreciate this. Like you have to, when you're doing the underwriting, you have to project, vacancy on a per tenant basis. And you kind of go look at their lease and say, okay, this tenant has got really good credit and they're not going anywhere till the end of their lease, but there's a chance they won't renew. And so you have to like sort of make this guess as to like how likely are they to renew. And you can only do that by like knowing how successful they are. And you don't always have access to their books. So like for us, we're looking at this grocery store that's in our building. And when we're trying to underwrite it, we're looking at it and saying, okay, if we drive by at a random time, how many cars are in the parking lot? We're doing stuff like that to try to determine whether or not they're going to renew their lease. And it turns out they did renew, so it worked out. And we based that on the fact that there wasn't any competing, stores in the area. There wasn't vacant space of a similar size close by for them to easily move to. And so we just kind of went, okay, we think they're going to renew, and it worked out. And they were close to the end of the lease, which is one of the reasons we got a better deal on the building at the time. But I mean, it was a calculated risk, and we recognized that risk, and we had to have more cash reserves to account for the fact that they might have moved out and taken, 30% of the building down when 30% was already vacant, which would have made it a really not good investment for at least for a period, right?
Yeah. Quite risky. So what would you say is like one of your biggest challenges so far, with all this experience that you have?
Well, so the thing that's bugged me the most is that 32 unit building that we financed incorrectly, right? Because what we did is we were talking to a real estate broker, that specialized in multifamily, and he's like, yeah, they've already underwritten it. It's teed up for a non-recourse, and we're like, oh, that sounds really great. Like we won't have to personally guarantee this loan. And there's, of course, and I know you've covered this on some of your shows before, but there's a lot of steps involved in getting qualified as a key principal and all this. So we went through all of that stuff. But we didn't ask the right questions, and we ended up with 9.5 years of yield maintenance, where if we'd paid a quarter point more in interest, we would be on a step down prepayment, and we'd be out in a year. Now we have 6 additional years of being stuck with that financing at a time when interest rates have fallen. Now we didn't know they were going to fall; they were pretty low when we locked it up, but we probably are 1% above market now. And also having a bunch of equity tied up. So that's the thing, is that there's a lot, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's the big challenge, right? Is if you don't know how much, it costs to change the terms, and you don't even know to ask if it's possible to get a different prepayment penalty, then, and maybe you don't even really appreciate, like we didn't, and what yield maintenance even really meant and how they calculated it. I mean, we had a general idea, but it can get very expensive in a falling rate environment because you have to pay the amount that they expected to get in interest. So essentially you pay the interest for the rest of the term. And that's so much money at this point that it's just not reasonable for us to refinance. Yeah. But again, I mean, it's not that big of a problem. I mean, other problems we've had are like dealing with sellers. We had, we bought this 41 unit building last year that took us almost 6 months to close, and it should have closed in 3 because the sellers just weren't cooperating at all. I mean, they said they want to sell, and we love the deal, but I mean, they would do things like make up leases. Like we would ask for the leases, and they'd say, yeah, we'll get them to you. And then we'd get a whole stack of leases that were signed like 2 days ago, right? They just went and got their people to sign leases. I would rather them say to me, we don't have leases, right? And then I can go, okay, check that off my list. We need to underwrite that these people might not be under lease, right? You know, it was just crazy stuff like that. And, you know, and their numbers were all over the place. And, you know, there were some units there that they said were fine and we couldn't get into. And then when we finally did get into them, they were like completely gutted and clearly not rentable. One was a basement unit that had, it was flooded and it had obviously been flooded for a long time. And they just decided to like put a lock on the door and not deal with it, you know? So, I mean, it ended up being a big disaster, but as a result, we got a building now. Unfortunately, we didn't tie that one up on long-term yield maintenance so we can refinance it, but we've got a building now that has a tremendous amount of equity in it because we've been able to, you know, fix all those issues and get some additional units up. And you know, it's a 41 unit building, but it only had like 36 rentable units when we bought it. So adding those extra units and then of course raising rents and you know, doing the repairs necessary to justify those rent increases have added a lot of value. I mean, in fact, our rent roll went from about $20,000 a month to just over $30,000 a month in about a 4-month period.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
$10,000 a month
Nice.
Additional rent. Yeah, without a lot of expenses. I mean, there were some expenses, but I mean, not anywhere near the amount that you would normally need to make that kind of adjustment.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. Was the sellers were difficult, but they were also really bad operators. And so as a result, there was a huge opportunity for us.
So I'm curious, you know, in that situation, you know, they were quite difficult to deal with. How do you think that, like, what did you learn from that situation as far as going forward, like going into the next deal? Like, how would you do things differently?
Well, I think one thing we would do is we would change the way our purchase agreement calculated the due diligence period because we were constantly fighting with them about getting due diligence extensions. Now our purchase agreements say that due diligence starts when we've received all the documents that we request in the contract. So that's a big, I mean, that's a, honestly, we probably should have been doing that originally, but we're doing it now. So that helps a lot. But another thing is like, sometimes you just have to recognize that you're not going to get everything you want. And you have to look at a deal and say, is this deal good enough that I'm willing to accept that I don't necessarily know X, Y, and Z? We've looked at some deals since that maybe we wouldn't have been interested in at all because we knew that the information was not always there. And another thing is like, you can provide what you think the numbers are and the more experience you have. And so like one thing we were concerned about with the 41 unit was that we didn't think it cash flowed enough to meet a debt coverage ratio for a bank. And so we had to work really hard to justify our purchase, right? Which meant we had to put a little bit more money down to be a little bit more conservative. But it also meant that we had to show the bank that the numbers were actually going to be significantly better because we knew that we would get this $10,000. Like it was obvious to us. But the presentation to the bank is really important because we had a couple of banks that we've worked with before turn us down saying, no, this thing's a 1-to-1 debt coverage ratio. That's not good enough. And, you know, we knew that it would quickly become like a 1.75, which is, you know, it's a home run deal, right? Mm-hmm. So we had to create a projection and present that on the front side so that people's first impression is good instead of their, you know, third impression is okay, right? Yeah. So the presentation to the banks are really important too. And we weren't able to do that on that deal because we didn't have good numbers and we thought the deal would work. But if we were going to do it again, I think I would model it based on what I think that the rent should be, what I think everything. And I would say, this is our pro forma. This is not a broker's pro forma. This is based on our experience. We own a building 2 miles away. This is the rent we get at that building. And these are similar units. And this is how long it took us to turn this building around. So we know that's how long it'll take us to turn that one around. So, I mean, it's just, that's experience-based, right? Like now that we've gone through it, it's easier for us to make those arguments, but also just making the argument helps.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and one other thing too, that you mentioned as far as, you know, having trouble getting into, I just wanted to circle back, getting into a few of those units. I know that I've heard in the past where some investors will just only kind of just walk through select units, right? Especially on some of the larger deals. And I hear you're sighing there. So what's your thought process
I mean,
that?
So I'm okay with that on one hand, because I recognize there's a cost to going through all the units. But I do think that at some point before you close a deal, you should probably look at all the units. I mean, because if you have a 100, 200 unit building and you've been in, 99% of the units, it's probably not that big of a deal. If one unit's terrible, you can absorb that. You can assign a risk value to that and say, hey, there's 3 units I haven't been in, but I know from experience that even if they're terrible, it's going to be $10,000 a unit, and I can afford that. So I don't think you necessarily have to be in 100% of every unit. But I know some people will say, oh, it's a 100-unit building. I'm going to go look at 4 units in each building, and I'm going to see 20 units, 20% of the total. That, to me, that's just silly. Because it's too easy for the seller to cherry pick the units they show you if you're only going to see a few. Now, I guess it's possible you could say to the seller, I want to see these 20 units, and they don't have any control over the numbers of the units that you pick and stuff. But the extra cost of going through the additional units, yes, it's an inconvenience to the seller, it's an inconvenience to the tenants. So you don't want to take it willy-nilly. You want to do it fast and efficient. But I do think you need to go through each unit, and I think you should have a punch list of things that you want to do, and have that sheet and just check off, hey, I looked at the electrical in this unit, and that way you can have a team go through and make those decisions very, very quickly about if there's anything that's out of line. And you're going to find problems. It doesn't matter if it's a 10-unit building or 150 units. You're going to find some problems. You just have to recognize, when there's too many problems. And the only way to do that, I think, is go through them all.
And on that note, in your opinion, what would you consider to be too many?
Well, it's a numbers game, right? So it depends on the deal. If you're like the deal that I was describing, the 41 unit, we knew there was a lot of problems. We knew that it needed windows in a substantial portion of the building, and knew that there were some furnace issues. Boiler was a problem. So there's a lot of issues that we knew about, but we also knew it was a really, really good deal. That it had a potential to be a home run. And so a deal like that can have a lot more problems than if you're going to buy a 200 unit building at a 6 cap or 5.5 cap. And you're looking at it and going, hey, maybe I can raise rents $25. Then you really can't afford to have really any problems. It's got to be a near perfect building at that point. So I think it just depends on the deal.
Okay. So what would be a key piece of advice that you would have for new people getting started?
So the biggest thing is, like I said earlier, I think it's a team sport. You need to be partnering with people that know what they're doing. Be careful though. There's a lot of syndicators out there that'll be like, oh yeah, if you raise money for me, you can be in the general partnership. That's okay if you're teaming up with the right people, but make sure you're teaming up with the right people. Make sure that you're not violating any laws, right? Don't jump into a syndication and get paid just to raise money, for example, which is a big, it's a big no-no. You get yourself in trouble, you get the other general partners in trouble as well. So you don't want to take that kind of liability. And, the other thing is, be thinking big too. Don't just stick around. Like I said earlier, my biggest thing is I feel like I waited too long to buy bigger deals. I saw you interviewed David Topin a while back. Mm-hmm. And I talked to him once in a while because he's a Detroit guy too, right? Like he's from Detroit originally. And I've seen him at a few events and stuff. And what I like about him is he just goes huge all the time. I'm not saying that's necessarily right, but it's really inspiring to me when you see someone who's in their early 20s buying 100 unit buildings or stuff like that. It's really cool. So, don't be afraid to do that. Look at those people that are doing the bigger deals and say, what do they know that I don't know? And how can I get there? Mm-hmm. And just get out there and do it. That's the thing. The first deal you make isn't going to be your best deal. Like I said, my 12 unit, I probably overpaid, but it's turned out really well. And if I didn't buy that 12 unit, I wouldn't have bought the 19. If I didn't buy the 19, I wouldn't buy the 32 and so on. And so, we're able to even now I'm closing next week on a 16 unit. It's a smaller deal than what we're doing a lot right now, but I'm seeing opportunities I wouldn't have seen before if I wasn't in that market. So you just got to get started.
All right. And as far as a suggestion for something like educational or to help people to get some foundation knowledge?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, obviously, the best education in the entire world is the old-fashioned real estate show. I'm joking, of course, but the old-fashioned real estate show does have some great tips on how to get started in real estate investing, so they can check that out. But listen, I read about 100 real estate books. I think Matt Faircloth has a really good book, Raising Private Capital. So if you're struggling with how to raise money, that's a good place to start. Joe Fairless's book, The Best Ever Apartment Syndication book, is really good. I think this book right here, which I didn't even plan this, but The Principles of Real Estate Syndication. This is like Samuel Freshman is like the guy who pretty much started the concept of syndication. So it's a hard read. It's meaty, but I mean, if you want to learn about syndication, that's a great place to start also. So.
Yeah. And on the old-fashioned, the real estate show there, the podcast, you got to have your bourbon with Jeff as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's a drinking show, right? So what we do is it's YouTube only. So if you try to find us, you can go to oldfashionedrealestate.com, but the best place is just youtube.com/oldfashionedrealestate, or just search old-fashioned real estate in YouTube. But it's we just sit down and have a bourbon. I mean, literally an old fashioned, right? So we just take bourbon and bitters and sugar, mix it together with an orange peel, and we pretty much talk about one topic until we're done with our drink, and then that's the end of the show. We have about 30 episodes that have been released now. We come out with a new one every other week. So yeah, there's some pretty good ones out there. I think the best one, if you just want to sample, is the market cycle one. I did it last year in May, but I think it's really timely right now, given what we're going through in the market. And it kind of tells you how to predict market downturns based on occupancy levels. And it's something that few people understand, but is really powerful stuff. So I would highly recommend that episode.
Excellent. I'll look for that, and I'll include a link on the webpage to that as well, a direct link to it.
Cool.
And,
yeah,
that'll be great. And so besides that as well, I know you mentioned you have another website, which is your name, right?
Yeah, jeffreyholst.com.
Okay.
Where people can find out more about my personal story. So I alluded to it at the beginning about the leukemia and stuff, but I talk about things like I have this philosophy of not having bad days. So we talk about that a bit on there. And then I have another podcast that's coming out, Last Life Ever, where we're just talking about living the best version of your life. So we're interviewing people that are doing extraordinary things with their life. And then also, ordinary people doing ordinary things that can benefit us. So like one guest that we're excited about coming up in a few weeks is a person who specializes in helping people get better sleep. I mean, everyone can use better sleep, right? Yeah. So she's not like, she's an extraordinary person. I don't want to, disparage her, but I mean, what she's doing is relatively ordinary. It's something everyone needs to do and understand, but it's also really helpful information. So it's just about like, living the best version of your life. And that's my personal website's more geared towards that stuff. I mean, does talk about my real estate holdings, because if it wasn't for multifamily real estate, I would have to have a job right now, and I wouldn't have spent the last month in Africa. I told you this off the air, but I just got back from a month in Africa. I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. I spent some time in Ethiopia and the Serengeti. I'm actually even thinking I might start a safari company now, because safaris are really fun. I don't know if you've ever done that, but you definitely need to check that out. So
not yet. I really want to do it. It sounds like a lot of fun, but I mean, I know you're going on another trip again. Which is going to be fun. Yeah, I mean, it's like... I'm
going to Egypt next month. So April, I'll be in Egypt for, I think, only for 8 or 10 days. We haven't actually bought the tickets yet, but...